Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a moment, but before we begin, I just want to give everyone a reminder that we do have interpretation for today's event. So if you require um, interpretation into Spanish, French, or Arabic, we do have interpretation. So you just need to change the channel on your screen. Um, and if you need any technical assistance, you can go ahead and let us know in the chat. We also would welcome everyone to introduce yourselves. It'd be great to know who's joining us, from where, which organizations. We're really excited to have so many friendly faces with us, and we have a really exciting event lined up for everyone today. So on behalf of ESCR-Net and APMDD and many of the other organizations that are supporting today, I just want to say welcome. Um, I think with that, we will go ahead and yeah, we'll get started. So just as a way of welcoming, my name is Basma Eid. I'm the campaigns director at ESCR-Net, the International Network for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And along with our friends at the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, APMDD, we're excited to host today's event entitled A United Front Against Debt, Fighting Neoliberal Financial Models for the Right to the Future. This event is part of the annual Global Week of Action, which many of us I know have participated in many years, really pushing our collective energies to bring accountability and justice to our communities. We have some really incredible speakers who are going to be sharing their perspectives and breaking down who really is driving the polycrisis that's plaguing many of our people, and what are the solutions that have long been pushed forward and advanced by communities on the front lines. So I just want to make a note about today's title. So A United Front Against Debt is a title that is a reference to an address made by the late Burkinabe revolutionary Thomas Sankara, who I know is familiar to many of us. Today is October 15th, which we know and commemorate as Sankara Day. This is the day he was unfortunately assassinated on in 1987. And A United Front Against Debt is the title of an address he gave just a few months before he was murdered in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia at the summit of the Organization of African Unity. And it was in Addis that Sankara had really called for the people of the Global South. In this moment, he was particularly talking to many of the newly liberated and independent states across Africa. But really, he was addressing many of the Global South to really form a united front against debt. And Sankara, he had a lot to say about debt and the impact of debt on many of our communities and our peoples. But he understood that debt's origins come from colonialism. And he said that, those who lend us money are those who colonized us. They're the same ones who used to manage our states and economies. These are the colonizers who indebted Africa through their brothers and cousins who were the lenders. We had no connections to this debt, and therefore we cannot pay for it. He was very clear in kind of calling debt a form of neocolonialism dominated by imperialism. And he really pushed the envelope in really calling out the colonizers for being responsible for the debt crisis. And unfortunately, I mean, the words that he said, decades and decades ago are still very much urgent, and they remain as urgent, I think, now more than ever. Across the world, we're witnessing multiple uprisings. Just a month ago in Nepal, we saw young people taking to the streets against corruption. A little over a year ago in Kenya, we saw also young people pushing back against the neoliberal order and corruption in government. And today in Ecuador and Peru, we're also seeing the ways that people are rising up, pushing back against an economic system that's really designed to just profit, that's pushing extractive development, all while the states, continue to perpetuate violence against people in struggle. And so it's very clear that we find ourselves in the midst of a polycrisis, as we call it. the crisis of debt, the crisis of the climate, and really a crisis of care. And so we're seeing the ways that debt distress continues to keep us, the global majority, trapped in a cycle of debt where, these unfair burdens, coupled with the climate crisis are really threatening our right to a future. And so we see that instead of putting our resources or investing in solutions to the climate crisis or giving support to caregivers that are sustaining life, we see that much of our resources are going towards debt servicing, debt repayment, and supporting policies that are just advancing privatization and really the gutting of social services and public provision. And so we want to really highlight and call out those who are responsible for this economic system that we're finding ourselves in, and really push a solution because there are, of course, solutions to capitalism's problems. And so I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and actually pass the mic to our good colleague and dear friend, May Buenaventura from the APMTD, the Asian People's Movement on Debt in Development. APMDD is one of the main coordinators of the Global Week of Action. May is the program manager of the Debt Justice Program at APMDD, and we would love to hear some remarks from May. So May, you have the floor. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and good evening from Manila. I just have a few slides, Basma. Is it possible to share my screen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of the Global Week of Action, and we held actions earlier because today is also International Rural Women's Day. So the World Bank is also implicated in that, in pushing for, agro-industrial estates and causing land grabs, displacement, and the further erosion of the rights of rural women. So I'll just, okay. Okay, so this is, I'm sure, a review for many of you. Slideshow, okay. So just to bring us back to, many years before and continuing to this day. So many of us here are from countries that are also colonies of the global north. So this colonization is continuing. It started centuries before, and the plunder of our resources, gold, spices, oil, rubber, and also the way that this has affected our economies and shape the kind of economies and societies we have today, which are really centered, driven by private gain. And we always say that our colonizers were also our first creditors. And then we can also see how labor has been exploited through forced labor and slavery, and of course the destruction of local economies. And we can really see clearly that even if this happened many, many years before, what is going on right now, the widespread exploitation of people and nature, can be traced to how the damage was inflicted on these local economic systems. And of course, they also carved up the world, and we can actually trace the conflict in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, to how the British carved up this part of the world. And even, I think Shireen would also know this, how we're calling certain regions as Middle East or Near East or Far East. So these are all in reference to a global north country, the UK. So, sorry. So we continue to see how these very unequal systems are reproduced under neocolonialism, the continuing exploitation and dispossession of peoples. No? So if we look back at how the debt trap was laid for the global south, as newly independent nations, we were, of course, pressured into borrowing heavily and then moved on to the formation of the IMF and the World Bank 81 years before, which has, of course, these institutions have, of course, uh, ch- cha- moved far from the original mandates. And now they're pretty much the gatekeepers of ensuring that a neoliberal agenda and policies, programs, and prescriptions are followed by compliant states. And we know for a fact that the structural adjustment programs in the 80s and the 90s, even though they deny it, continues to happen today. So there's still a push for the privatization of essential services. There's still, ceilings being imposed on the wages of the public sector, also promoting forms of so-called labor reforms, such as contractualization, which, as we know, intensifies the exploitation of labor. Of course, trade relations are also sharply unequal, and we've been reduced to really providing resources to the North, and that's how they built their wealth. So the flow of wealth and resources is from global South to global North. And of course, the multinational corporations, which continue to exploit our resources and enjoy the support of international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. So we actually, when we say debt crisis, we actually are not referring to specific periods or waves because we see the debt crisis as permanent for the global South. So we know for a fact that the loan prescriptions or the loan conditionalities that have been imposed upon us have resulted in very adverse consequences, also very anti-women and gender discriminatory. And this includes the privatization of water, for example, that simply assumes women will take up the slack for finding water when their households can no longer afford to get it from the market. More than the impacts is really this very insidious shaping of economies along neoliberal lines, catering to neoliberal interests. There's still promotion of privatization, deregulation, and market liberalization, also the privileging of the private sector and foreign investments, and the shifting of business risk to the public, such as what's happening with this very popular public-private partnerships and blended finance. And we're also seeing more borrowings in the future because this is also being pushed as as supposedly to find as climate finance, no, which goes against the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, in that the global North is the cause of this destabilization of the climate, but loans continue to be pushed on the global South, meaning we are being asked to pay for the damage that they caused. So from FFD4 that was concluded in June in Spain, we had high hopes, of course, and really pushed hard, but we also did not harbor any illusions. We saw it as an important space to engage with governments, also with networks. And so there's much to be done, something to build on, but we know it's not over, no? The work goes beyond Sevilla, goes beyond this year even, no? So if you look at the outcome document, there's of course claims that it's ambitious, but the Sevilla commitment is not legally binding. It's kind of a soft law. It has no timelines. It has no accountability mechanisms or enforcement measures. And as we know with declarations, if you remember, the right to development has never progressed beyond a declaration, and that's because these processes take a really long time. The tax convention alone, I think, is taking more than 15 years already. and that uh, it's useful to us because it carries the strength of a multilateral instrument, but it's also up to us to how we're going to use that in spaces outside of the UN. In terms of the rising cost of borrowing, there's also no substantive response to this issue. There's mention of reforming the international financial architecture and reducing borrowing costs, but also no concrete measures of how this can be brought forward. And developing countries, or global south countries, to continue to face high risk premiums of servicing burdens and fiscal constraints. So we also note the widening financing gaps. The SDGs alone, no country in Asia will be able to meet the SDGs by 2030. So that's a general observation by UNESCO. Of course, individually, there's different rates of progress amongst countries, but generally, this is the state. It's a dire state, and it says the estimate is that about 4 trillion that's needed to finance the gap in achieving the SDGs. So there's still a very marked reliance on private sector investments, which we know is, of course, profit-driven and uses a lot of market approaches. In terms of debt, we very poor debt restructuring measures. Even as they're already limited, there's no strong mechanism for enforcement. Criteria is also not clear. What is unsustainable debt or unpayable debt? And there's no recognition of illegitimate and odious debts, which global civil society has consistently pushed hard for. It also does not offer any concrete assurances that there will be fairness and adequacy and speed in addressing debt-distressed countries. Another problem was that the commitment is really still largely aspirational. And we also don't know when the next conference will be held, because it depends on the appetite of states to hold one. Like the one in Sevilla was held a decade after the one in Addis Ababa. The commitment itself is full of references to leveraging private finance, which simply means that public money is put up to attract the investments from the private sector. We always we remain firm that funding for essential services should be public, as well as climate finance, which should also be new, additional, and public. And you can really feel that it's as if the world is not in a deepening poly-crisis, because there's no urgency in the fact that there's no set timelines. It's it's really was really disappointing. So what do we do? That's always the the question. No? So it means that our work is not done, and that really to be able to, because when we push hard, you can expect that our targets of our objectives for profound reforms will also be pushed back by those who block it. Even before Sevilla, the references to a UN framework convention, which we wanted to be able to democratize debt governance, since this is held in decision making is controlled and dominated by the narrow and opaque spaces of the IMF and the World Bank. This was also removed, even though there was support from African groups, also the alliance of small island states, but these were blocked by the global north, particularly the EU. So as a way of escalating our struggles and our campaigns, we're holding the Global Week this week as part of a overarching overarching theme of This World is Ours, Resist, Reclaim, Rise Up for System Change, which is a call for global mobilizations. This week being the third one, and then we move on to COP30. So I invite you to visit these sites. And if you go to this site of the Global Week of Action, you will find there the statement, the common statement, also materials that you can use, and also ways of joining the Global Day of Coordinated Mobilizations tomorrow, one of which is a Twitter action at 2 p.m. UTC. So yeah, let's press on, fight on. Uh, that's the only way to go, I think. So thank you very much. I just want to, I forgot this slide, but I put it here because this is what he has many quotable lines, but maybe just as a last message that he said that the most important thing is to bring the people to a point where they have self-confidence and belief in their agency and understand that they can at last be the authors of their own well-being, or in other words, be masters of our destiny. And at the same time, we acknowledge that sacrifices will be made, that we have to put the time and energies into fighting for really transformative change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, May, and thank you for ending on such an inspirational quote. And I think I would agree that Sankara has I don't think he said anything that I would ever disagree with, so I really appreciate you bringing that one into it. And thank you for setting the context. I think we find ourselves in a very particular moment in the aftermath of FFD4, which, as you said, we were under we had very, very little hopes. I think we knew what we were getting ourselves into. But at the same time, I think seeing the ways that we are moving forward as collective people, really making demands, I think is important to highlight, and that we aren't taking this sitting down. And we will be continue to push for accountability regardless of a declaration, and I think the lack of political will from many states, because we know change will never come from the top, but really will come from the bases. So I wanted to put us into sort of the first section of today's event. And what we really were hoping to do is sort of spend some time. We often talk a lot about the multilateral development banks. We talk a lot about the roles of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, of course, these kind of major Bretton Woods institutions that have been around for over 80 years, who've really dominated and have really set the agenda of the way development finance looks, in a way that's neoliberal, in a way that is extractive, that is supports privatization, goes against what many of us believe. But we also recognize that there are a number of institutions that are complicit in pushing forward that agenda, including private institutions, but also public ones. And we wanted to spend some time in the beginning to break down the role of some of the public development banks, who are very much implicated in sort of pushing forward and in promoting, I would say, the policies that have led to the multiple crises that we find ourselves in. May, I think you are the one who sort of often refers to some of the regional development banks as sort of the World Bank for their different regions, right? So in Asia, we can see the way that the Asian Development Bank sort of plays the role of like a mini World Bank in Asia. In Africa, we can see the same. In Latin America, in the Swana region with the Islamic Development Bank. Of course, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of public development banks, but we've thought that it would be an important opportunity today to sort of break some of them down, understanding their mandates, what responsibilities these banks have as opposed to other institutions. And so we wanted to look at two regions. So we have two wonderful speakers who are going to share their reflections on the role of the public development banks, the PDBs, and their kind of complicity in driving the crisis. So from the International Accountability Project, we're joined by Rosario Facina. Rosario works at IAP, the International Accountability Project, as a community organizer for Latin America and the Caribbean, where she supports communities defending their rights and influence development decisions. And then from Indonesia, we're happy to be joined by Titi Soentoro. Titi is a women's rights advocate and dedicates herself to mainstream women's rights and gender considerations into policy draftings and reviews. Related to environmental and social safeguards, information disclosure, consultation, and accountability mechanisms of the international development and climate finance institutions, including the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Green Climate Fund, and many more. So we have about 25 minutes for this section, and I think to maybe get us started, perhaps I'll give the floor first to Titi to share, who I know is experiencing some heavy rains in Indonesia, so hopefully her connection maintains, and then we'll pass the floor to Rosario. So Titi, thank you so much for joining us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Basma. Good evening from Indonesia. So let's talk about the Asian Development Bank, one of the PDBs that have really important roles in our Asia regions. So talking about mandates, ADB mandate is to foster economic growth and cooperation in Asia and the Pacific, while eradicating extreme poverty through the environmentally sustainable development. So it's stated, it's in there, if you can see that this mandate in their website. So then its role is to promote development by providing loans, grants, and technical assistance to its developing member countries, while also encouraging investment of public and private capitals. The ADB acts as a facilitator by providing financial assistance, policy advice, and co-financing to help countries with their development plans and to promote regional economic growth and trade. So it's read so nicely, and it's really an aspiration that we have of financial institutions in our regions with this kind of important mandates. Then let's see how this aspiration is materialized related to the debt, care, climate, crisis, and so on. So, however, if we see the experience in Asia, the debt burden to ADB, so its privatization measure and its finance to false climate solution projects and failure in its accountability process are some factors, among others, that trigger systemic vulnerability of Asian developing countries. So let's talk about the debt trap. The ADB lending contributes to the region's debt burden, which primarily affect the risk of regional financial instability, particularly for Asia economic vulnerable countries, and that's a lot. We can mention like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and other countries. The debt burden leads to higher borrowing costs and limited access to funding. The increasing debt burden makes it more challenging for those vulnerable countries to support their own economies, including to finance their essential public services like health and education, because they need to repay the debt. The money is used for that instead for supporting their own people. So as a result, poor and vulnerable population are disproportionately impacted. So in this condition, if the fiscal resources of the countries are strained, the country risks falling into a debt trap that requires further borrowing, exacerbating their financial obligation. Some economists, like we know, like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, have experienced persistent vulnerabilities due to high debt levels. A high reliance on external creditors like the ADB makes countries vulnerable to external shocks and the conditionalities imposed by the lenders, whether ADB and other foreign lenders. So it potentially compromising national policy autonomy. So we have that experience in Indonesia when Indonesia requests support from the IMF to overcome the economic crisis. Besides the neoliberal package, the Indonesian government has to submit national state budget, and it has to be approved by the IMF before it's can be implemented. So we see the national sovereignty over their own state budget is not in the hand of the country, but on the hand of the financial institutions. Then the other factors is the privatization. So the promotion of privatization as a part of neoliberal policy package enabled by ADB loans worsened poverty, inequality, and deprivation. The ADB has promoted privatization and public-private partnership, resulting in the privatization of public services and the transfer of financial burden to taxpayers. In several cases, this has led to increased costs for the public and subsidies for private corporation. Consequently, people may experience higher utility costs and decline in service quality, while public assets and wealth are transferred to private entities. This trend has been observed in the power sectors of countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, India, and Pakistan. Another factor is harmful infrastructures and climate solution projects. Historically, the ADB has concentrated on large-scale infrastructures projects, particularly in the area of power generation and transportation. These projects often neglect critical social aspects, leading to adverse environmental and social impacts. Such projects prioritize private and foreign interests over the public goods, potentially leading to burdensome debt and limited poverty reduction. Moreover, recently, concerns have been raised regarding the ADB financing projects that are harmful under the pretext of a just transition during the poly crisis. Specific issues include ongoing funding for fossil gas, large-scale dams, waste-to-energy incinerators, and geothermal energy projects, which have displaced community, damaged the environment, and increased national debt burdens. Moreover, ADB also lacks of mandatory human rights and environmental assessment, weak system for determining project risk, transparency, and insufficient public consultation processes. This issue led affected communities vulnerable and hinder meaningful participation. There are ongoing challenges with a lack of transparency in consultation processes and delayed environmental and social impact assessment, which limit public oversights. Consultation processes are often limited and inequitable, highlighting the need for more structured and inclusive consultation, including those conducted in local languages and with feedback loops. So one case that can give more clearer pictures on that in a geothermal case study from Indonesia. So the ADB, together with the World Bank, is a promoter of geothermal development in Indonesia. For that purpose, ADB financed a geothermal sectoral reform program to remove policies and institutional barriers to geothermal resource development and assist with geothermal power investment transactions. This is also clearly states in the draft of the new policy review. The same pattern is still there. Testimonies of women experiencing problem regarding the exploration and exploitation of 7 geothermal plants financed by the ADB demonstrated that they are posed to same issue, including health issue arising from noise, water, air pollution, deforestation, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, earthquake, loss of community livelihoods, and land conflicts. Consequently, local and indigenous community often oppose geothermal plants because it bring disadvantage to them. The resistance leading to intimidation and violence from the governments and companies and response to their resistance. So looking at those issues, finally, I would say that ADB, according to looking at its mandate, is successful in foster the economic growth of the corporation, but fails to eradicate extreme poverty in the developing country of Asia through environmentally sustainable development as it should be in their mandates, but instead exacerbate the country's economic, social, and environmental vulnerability. Thank you. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Titi. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your remarks, and I think it's very ironic, of course, the mandate that they say that they claim that they have. But as you very well said, they're of course serving not the interests of the people, but really serving the interests of the corporations, of those who seek to make profit off of these types of investment projects. And it's interesting with the public development banks in particular, who I think are really trying to position themselves as the leaders of climate finance, financing the just transition. But really, there can be no just transition when the only types of projects they're pushing are just continuing the same status quo. So from Asia, we're going to travel all the way to Latin America. Although I think we'll see that unfortunately there are many similarities from what Titi just shared to sort of what the experience is for our siblings in Latin America. And so I will now give the floor to Rosario, who will also share some perspectives.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now. Just a second. Okay, great. I think you can see my screen. And just an FYI to the translators, I'm going to switch to Spanish for my presentation, even though the slides are in English. But as I'm going to be speaking about the Latin American region, I feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish. So yeah, cambio el español. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Un honor también hablar en el mismo panel que Titi. Lo que voy a hacer ahora en una primera parte es quizás un zoom out de lo que venía hablando Titi, y voy a aprovechar para hacer una contextualización un poquito rápida de por qué creo que deberíamos estar prestándole atención a estos bancos de desarrollo públicos. Porque cuando estamos hablando de deuda hoy, y esto me parecía importante traerlo a colación, como ya fue dicho en la introducción y también es algo que recuperó Titi, no estamos hablando solamente de deuda financiera, lo que estamos hablando es de un modelo que se genera a través de la deuda y del control que se empieza a sostener frente a las democracias y gobiernos, sobre todo del sur global, que están atrapados en un proceso de dependencia muy importante. Y obviamente uno de los actores más poderosos para sostener ese modelo de extracción y de control son los bancos públicos de desarrollo, que ahora vamos a hablar un poco mejor en las próximas filminas sobre bien específicamente qué son y cómo funcionan para entender luego el impacto en la región, pero que básicamente se encuentran en la intersección entre el dinero privado y el dinero público. Entonces, ¿por qué nos parece súper importante mirarlos? Porque están moldeando las narrativas sobre qué es lo que consideramos por desarrollo, porque están condicionando las democracias, y a través de condicionar las democracias lo que están haciendo es moldear las agendas de los países e imponer agendas que no son propias de los países, y por lo general lo hacen invisibilizando las voces de las comunidades y las alternativas comunitarias que podrían surgir como proyectos alternativos. Y además de estar moldeando qué es lo que entendemos por desarrollo, están moldeando lo más importante, que es quién se va a beneficiar de ese desarrollo, y ahí es donde está el meollo de la cuestión. Entonces, como bien decía Titi, se presentan muchas veces como quienes están liderando el progreso, pero la verdad es que sus decisiones, cómo se avanza, dónde va el dinero y cuáles son esos proyectos que se aprueban, quiénes se benefician, están muy lejos de significar un progreso para los países donde se están enfocando estos bancos. En la parte derecha de la pantalla fui identificando muy rápidamente, bueno, a qué bancos específicamente nos estamos refiriendo cuando hablamos de bancos públicos de desarrollo. Obviamente están ahí más o menos ordenados por región. No es un mapa exhaustivo, por supuesto que se pueden seguir agregando. Acá me faltan además los nacionales, muchos de los nacionales que también tienen un rol muy importante. Sobre la parte superior están aquellos que actúan entre regiones. Entonces, ¿qué hablamos cuando hablamos de el financiamiento o la financiación para el desarrollo? Como les decía, se puede resumir muy brevemente con un flujo de dinero público a través de instituciones nacionales o internacionales o multilaterales, porque puede adoptar distintas formas, hacia proyectos que promuevan el desarrollo. Y esto se puede hacer de distintas maneras, se puede hacer a través del otorgamiento de préstamos, de garantías, de inversión, de asistencia técnica, y como bien decía Titi, a lo mismo que el Asian Development Bank plantea, lo plantean casi todos los bancos que estaban en el mapa anterior, siempre es a través de lemas, grandes lemas, como la reducción de la pobreza o la transición verde, como ahora está como súper en agenda. Si bien todos tienen características distintas, podemos resumir como tres grandes rasgos que comparten todos. Y acá perdón por todas las introducciones, pero me parece bueno que estemos todos como en la misma hoja y que podamos partir de la misma base. Como dije, se financian con dinero público. En sus boards hay personas vinculadas a los gobiernos y como tienen mandatos de interés público, tienen que respetar los derechos humanos como todas las instituciones públicas que tienen mandatos de derechos humanos. Pero como bien sabemos, muchos de estos bancos, aunque mantengan la narrativa esta, terminaron siendo instrumentos del ajuste neoliberal, terminaron siendo la excusa para la privatización de los servicios, la desregularización y un montón de proyectos extractivos en el nombre del desarrollo. Por eso a nosotros nos importa mucho salir a disputar de qué están hablando cuando hablan de desarrollo estos bancos y qué es lo que están generando con estas deudas. Y cuando digo deuda es porque por más de que son, como decía, dineros públicos que a través de instituciones están yendo a manos, sobre todo, de privados o generando sobredeuda en países que ya seguramente estaban sobreendeudados. Me refiero a esto, solo por traer un ejemplo. Uno de los grandes lemas de los bancos es sostener una transición energética o hacer una green transition, y el Energy Finance Tracker, que es una iniciativa de IAP, donde tomamos información del sistema de alerta temprana, que luego voy a contar un poquito más de qué se trata, pero básicamente recompilamos bancos e información de 16 bancos de desarrollo e intentamos que la información llegue a tiempo a las comunidades para que sean alertadas de los proyectos que están financiando. Considerando esa información, el Energy Finance Tracker, que es como la versión del sistema de alerta temprana, pero para ver proyectos de energía, identificó que durante el 2022 y junio del 2025 se habían invertido estos 16 bancos unos 245.000 millones de dólares en el sector energético bajo esta bandera de la transición energética verde. Y el 64% de esos fondos se dieron a través de préstamos y tan solo 7% a través de subvenciones o donaciones. Lo que está hablando es que estos financiamientos para el desarrollo terminan generando deuda más que haciendo un cambio profundo en las políticas que tendrían que estar financiando, sobre todo en países que ya están sobreendeudados. Y además estos bancos que dicen estar promocionando una transición energética verde, unos 19.000 millones de dólares se destinaron a proyectos que están vinculados a petróleo y a gas, o sea que están todo el tiempo volviendo a fortalecer la dependencia con los combustibles fósiles. Incluso en los proyectos que sí tenían que ver con energía renovable, que les podemos dar ese beneficio de la duda, que sí estaban vinculados a beneficios renovables, que fueron tan solo 522 proyectos, 384 fueron a través de préstamos. Es decir, que aún en proyectos que podrían llegar a estar promoviendo una transición energética más justa, lo hacen a través de sobreendeudar a países del sur global. Particularmente en América Latina, teniendo en cuenta la información del Energy Finance Tracker, pero tan solo para el año 2024, pudimos identificar que había 10 proyectos que estaban vinculados a justamente procesos de transición energética. Ahí está la distribución geográfica, y todos tenían en común algo, que primero 6 de esos 10 proyectos estaban liderados por el sector privado, y luego que se hicieron sin consenso con las comunidades, sin consulta previa, con un impacto muy significativo en comunidades indígenas y rurales. Entonces, un poco este patrón lo que nos va mostrando es que en lugar de financiar la transformación, estos bancos lo que están haciendo es financiar la dependencia y la deuda en el nombre del desarrollo. Solo un caso un poco ejemplar, yo estoy hablando desde Buenos Aires, Argentina, así que me es muy difícil estar en una conversación que esté referida a la deuda sin referirme al caso puntual de Argentina, ya que estamos en un momento muy particular respecto a la deuda. Así que me parecía importante también traerlo a colación como tan solo un disparador para después seguir la conversación en las preguntas. Pero el caso de Argentina es muy paradigmático, tenemos una historia muy conflictiva con la deuda de nuestro país, así como otros países del sur global o de la minoría, de la mayoría global. Y tan solo en el 2025, que digo, para tener en cuenta las cifras y lo corto del plazo, se firmó un nuevo acuerdo con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, que por supuesto no es un banco público de desarrollo, pero sí es una institución financiera que es muy importante en el rol justamente del sobreendeudamiento de los países del sur global. Tan solo en abril de este año se firmó un nuevo contrato por 20.000 millones de dólares, que bueno, hay un desembolso inmediato muy alto. Fue algo inédito para el Fondo Internacional, el Fondo Monetario Internacional, y esto significa que con ese dinero, desde el 2018, Argentina es el país que más recursos está recibiendo del Fondo Monetario Internacional en la historia de la institución financiera. Pero sin embargo, si bien se hizo justamente en el nombre de promover un bienestar social más amplio y de poder generar un impacto más positivo en la economía del país, lejos de estabilizar la economía argentina, lo que hizo este préstamo fue profundizar gravemente la crisis local, macroeconómica. La construcción cayó un 15%, la industria cayó un 11%, se perdieron más de 130.000 puestos de trabajo, y el presupuesto nacional se redujo un 26% en términos reales, y eso se tradujo muy rápidamente en que hubo 40% menos de recursos vinculados a la educación, 47% de recursos menos vinculados a promover y asegurar vivienda a los sectores más vulnerables, y sobre todo se recortó 83% el presupuesto vinculado a medio ambiente. Todo esto, mientras estaban ajustando todos estos derechos básicos en nombre de mejorar las arcas nacionales, como dijo el FMI, que era para sanear la economía argentina, mientras se estaba haciendo todo este ajuste, recortando derechos básicos de la población argentina, se empezaron a impulsar un montón de proyectos de desarrollo bajo algo que se llamó el régimen de incentivos de grandes inversiones, o RIGI, en Vaca Muerta o en GNL, que son proyectos vinculados con petróleo y gas, justamente otra vez fortaleciendo nuestra dependencia con las energías fósiles y contradiciendo todos los compromisos climáticos. En ese contexto, los bancos de desarrollo, públicos de desarrollo, como por ejemplo FIC y el BID, seguían generando deuda vinculada a la transición energética en Argentina, aunque seguían promoviendo la deuda a través de energías fósiles. Creo que esos dots rojos que me aparecen en el chat es que me quedé sin tiempo, así que voy a pasar a la última filmina, pero es simplemente para decir que justamente la deuda y el extractivismo no están solamente financiando, no es simplemente un instrumento financiero, lo que están haciendo es moldear modelos de desarrollo y modelos de gobierno y de democracia, que son sobre todo desiguales y sobre todo insostenibles para los países en el sur global. Hay muchísimas herramientas que se pueden plantear desde las comunidades, fui nombrando algunas, como el sistema de alerta temprana o el Energy Finance Tracker, como también, por ejemplo, las Community Lead Responses o las acciones comunitarias para poder dar frente a estas narrativas. Desde IAP estamos trabajando fuertemente para eso y estoy abierta a que las podamos charlar o en las preguntas poder entrar en detalle en cada una de ellas. Así que nada, dejo esta reflexión final. Agradezco la participación, perdón por excederme de tiempo y quedo disponible en las preguntas para seguir la conversación.
Thank you, Rosario. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing such deep and important reflections. I think oftentimes, I think for for many of us who might not be experts or feel like we're experts in development finance, sometimes these topics can feel inaccessible, but I think you made a really great effort of sort of breaking this down and sort of really digesting, I think, what can be very complicated matter. I think, like you said, the quote unquote understanding of what development is and how we see development is very different from what the sort of prescription of development that's been imposed on many of us. And so the way that's played out obviously has had such a terrible repercussion and implication on many people across Latin America. But clearly, as Titi was sharing, in Asia, we can say it's the same across Swana and across many other regions. And so in this first section, we were really hoping to sort of problematize, break down, I think, the role of some of these development finance institutions. And I think both you and Titi were sort of starting to shift us into sort of the next section of thinking about, so what can we do, right? How do we actually respond to this? We're not here just to talk about problems, but really also to talk about solutions, many of which have long existed. And so I think maybe what I'll do is bring up my colleague Collins Lico, who coordinates our economic policy working group at the network, who will sort of facilitate our next section. And maybe just one reminder to anyone who's joining the webinar today, we will have a brief moment for question and answer after all of the presentations are finished. And so if you do have a question, we would encourage you to use the Q&A function. I know some people are leaving questions in the chat, which is okay, but if you can use the Q&A section, that would be wonderful. So with that, I will give the floor to Collins, who will introduce our next two speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basma. Hello, everyone. Good to see all of you. And thank you so much for joining our call today. Yeah, so we want to jump on to our next set of speakers. But before that, thank you so much to May for setting the context, Rosario and Titi for really sharing the real lived experiences under the programs and actions of these institutions. Indeed, we continue to see the continuation of economic colonialism, control and dominance, but this time modern colonization has actually been institutionalized, as we all can see, via hegemonic financial and capital control. We are witnessing a global financial system that is weaponizing debt and using it as a political and economic tool for control, especially for the global South impoverished countries. Multilateral development banks, as you've heard, as well as regional development banks and other public development bank, as well as other institutions, financial institutions, are part of this dominant global economic system, which many of our members as well as allies have described as being extractive, inconsistent, unequal, and very incompatible with the current needs of the global South. Unfortunately, these institutions and their financial policies were actually strategically established to sustain colonial legacies via what you've continued to see them do, financial practices as well as the conditions, from driving the now currently unsustainable debts through excessive loan-based finance, conditionalities, and prioritizing debt payments over human rights and other priorities, to financing fossil fuel and other false climate solutions, as our former speakers have actually said. Titi and Rosario have actually put that very clearly. But on the forefront, we've seen, social movements, we've seen CSOs, communities have been on the forefront, actually pushing back on this new colonial, new liberal financial system. And they've been also trying to front other alternatives that can actually work, instead of us continuing to rely on these MDB-led development and financing models. So how do we stop this bleeding? How do we stop the banks from further worsening the already very precarious situation? So to help us understand some of the existing alternatives, but also some of, what civil society, communities, and movements have been fronting, we have two amazing speakers. I'll introduce them one at a time. So the first speaker is Shireen Talat. Shireen is a feminist movement leader, activist economist, and a documentary filmmaker dedicated to feminist climate and economic justice. She founded the MENA Feminist for Economic, Ecological Justice and Development, MENAFEM, a regional network advocating for transformative policies that center women's rights, economic sovereignty, and climate resilience. Her work challenges austerity measures and harmful financial policies imposed by these global financial institutions and emphasizing the importance of the intersection of gender, climate, and economic justice. So Shireen, what demands and financing alternatives are communities, movements, and CSOs advocating for? And I know just recently there was the Rabat Declaration. What are some of the key feminist collective demands are we demanding from some of these institutions? If you may take the floor now, Shireen.
Yes, thanks a lot, Collins, and thanks a lot, Basma, and all my colleagues and speakers. And allow me to speak in Arabic today. شكرا جدا للجميع. أنا طبعا بحيي كل الزميلات والمتدخلات، وبتفق مع كل ما تم طرحه. احنا النهارده بنجتمع في لحظة أزمة عميقة، أزمة الديون وسياسات التقشف والانهيار المناخي اللي بتتقاطع وتخلق واقعا واحدا لشعوبنا، شعوب الجنوب. الحلول المفروضة من المؤسسات المالية الدولية للأسف لا تعالج الجرح اللي اتفتح بسببهم، بل بتوسعه. البنوك التنموية متعددة الأطراف والمؤسسات المالية الدولية اللي بتدعي إنها تعمل من أجل التنمية، وكم من الجرائم ترتكب تحت اسم التنمية، لأنها في الحقيقة بتعيد إنتاج نفس الأنماط الكولونيالية اللي بتخلي شعوبنا ودول الجنوب في دائرة التبعية والفقر. إحنا دلوقتي في ذكرى توماس سانكارا، وللمفارقة هي أيضا نفس المواعيد للانيوال ميتينجز أو اجتماعات السنوية للبنك الدولي وصندوق النقد اللي أنا موجود دلوقتي بحضرها في واشنطن. مفارقة يعني عجيبة، في نفس اليوم اللي تم اغتيال فيه سانكارا مجموعات من المسؤولة عن اغتياله بتجتمع وبتقرر مصائرهم. فالحقيقة نزف سانكارا وما زالت اقتصاداتنا تنزف في خدمة الدين وفي النهب البيئي والقصقصة. والنزيف مش صدفة، ده نتيجة نظام كامل مبني على الهيمنة والاستعمار. علشان كده وكنا في خضم المناقشات حوالين ال FFD4 الفاينانس اند ديفلوبمنت سامت اللي حصلت في سيفيا شهر 7 اللي فات، واللي كان عندنا امل كبير فيها في التغيير، لانها جاءت باحباط شديد واعاده انتاج للعجله الاستعماريه للاسف. بس ارتقينا احنا مجموعات من النسويات اللي هدفها العدالة الاقتصادية والإيكولوجية، إن احنا نجتمع في مايو 2025. كنا أكتر من 50 يعني نسوية وفاعلين في هذا المجال. معظمنا من الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. أنا عارفة إنه كلمة شرق أوسط كلمة استعمارية، ولكن علينا أن نتفق ماذا نريد أن نطلق على أنفسنا. اجتمعنا في الرباط وأطلقنا خريطة طريق الرباط من أجل التحول الاقتصادي الاجتماعي والإيكولوجي النسوي. ولدت هذه الخارطة اللي أتمنى إن زمايلي في ESCR يشارك معانا الرباط رود ماب والرباط ديكلاريشن اللي موجودين بالعربي والإنجليزي. ولدت هذه الطريقة من أصوات الحركة النسوية والمجتمعية وقادة القواعد الشعبية من مختلف أنحاء المنطقة، من مصر ومن المغرب ومن السودان، من تونس، من فلسطين، من لبنان وغيرها. بمشاركة أيضا في أختية زميلتنا من الجنوب العالمي، من قارتنا الحبيبة أفريقيا، ومن إيشا، وأيضا من الشمال العالمي، اللي بيشاركونا نفس الهم ونفس المسؤولية. فزي ما قلت، ولدت هذه الخريطة من أصوات الحركات النسوية وقادة القواعد الشعبية. خريطة الرباط ليست مجرد وثيقة سياسية، ولكن هي أقدر أقول مشروع جماعي لبناء اقتصاد بديل قائم على العدالة والرعاية والتضامن في مواجهة كل أشكال الاستعمار القديم والجديد. أولا لأنها وضعت هذا الجرح أمامها، الدين والنهب والسيطرة، واتكلمت حول أن الديون ليست قضية مالية فقط، بل هي انسترومنت، هي أداة للاستعمار والهيمنة. وكلنا شفنا إزاي تم استخدام استخدام الديون في مواجهة بعض الدول، خصوصا في ما له علاقة بالجينوسايد أو المذبحة والإبادة التي حدثت في غزة. اليوم أكثر من 54 دولة بتنفق على خدمة الدين، أكثر مما تنفق على التعليم والصحة. ده مش فشل في الإدارة، بل ده نظام يحكم ويتحكم مقصود. في مصر مثلا برامج صندوق النقد من 2016 اللي بتحث وأتت على رفع الدعم وخفض قيمة العملة وتقليص الإنفاق الاجتماعي، اللي دفعت بسببه النساء الثمن الأكبر. أسعار السلع الأساسية ارتفعت بنسبة تجاوزت 60% في سنة واحدة. أعباء الرعاية غير المدفوعة تضاعفت. في المغرب مثلا مشاريع النمو الأخضر والانتقال الطاقي اللي بيمولها البنك الأوروبي والبنوك التنموية، البنك الأوروبي اللي هو EIB والبنوك التنموية متعددة الأطراف الأخرى، شكلها تبدو واعدة على الورق، ولكنها في الواقع بتفتح الباب أمام خصخصة الموارد، تهجير المجتمعات الريفية، تحويل الطاقة المتجددة إلى استثمار ربحي بدل ما تكون ملكية مجتمعية. خريطة الرباط بتسمي ده كله كل هذه الاستثمارات اللي تحت مسمى التنمية والانتقال الطاقي إلى آخره الوجه الجديد للاستعمار. استعمار أخضر، استعمار رقمي، استعمار اقتصادي مغلف بشعارات المساواة والتمكين. ودي مش حوادث منفصلة، بل جزء من نظام عالمي يحتكر فيه الشمال القرار المالي ويفرض على الجنوب نماذج تنموية تعمق التبعية وبتهمش الرعاية والعمل الاجتماعي وبتستنزف مواردنا. الحاجة التانية اللي ركزت عليها خريطة طريق الرباط هي استعادة السلطة العامة والتمويل العام. الركيزة الأولى في خريطة الرباط هي استعادة التمويل العام أو الإنفاق العام، وبناء قدرة الدولة لخدمة الناس لا الدائنين. يعني إنهاء سياسات التقشف كشرط للقرض، إلغاء الديون غير المشروعة وغير المستوردة، إعادة الاستثمار في الصحة والتعليم والرعاية والغذاء والسكن، ضمان ان تمويل المناخ والتنميه يمر عبر قنوات عامه شفافه وديمقراطيه، ولا يخلق عجله اخرى للدين، بل ياتي على طريق جرانتس. يعني لا يمكن تحقيق عداله مناخيه من خلال ادوات الدين، لا يمكن بناء انتقال عادل على اساس القروض وضمانات الربح، لا يمكن. تدعو خريطة الطريق إلى ميثاق عالمي جديد للتمويل العام قائم على الإصلاح وإعادة التوزيع والمسؤولية التاريخية. آه، الموارد العامة يجب أن تستخدم لإصلاح الظلم التاريخي وليس العكس. الظلم التاريخي من النهب الاستعماري اللي استمر وقام على استخراج الثروات من الجنوب لصالح الشمال، ولا زال قائم إلى الآن وبياخد أشكال متعددة. وعندما نتحدث عن تمويل الرعاية فنحن لا نطلب إحسانا، بل نطالب بالعدالة. وهناك فرق، هي ليست هبات، هي عدالة. اللي ركز أيضا، الحاجة الثالثة اللي ركز عليها الرباط رود ماب أو خريطة طريق الرباط، هي البدائل النسوية والمجتمعية اللي تسلط خريطة الرباط الضوء على نماذج قائمة بالفعل في منطقتنا. في جنوب تونس تدير تعاونيات نسائية مزارع تعمل بالطاقة الشمسية وتتيح الغذاء والدخل دون ديون. في صعيد مصر تدير مجموعات ادخار نسوية، صناديق تضامن مجتمعية بديلة عن مؤسسات التمويل الأصغر الاستغلالية. في المغرب مثلا تبنى شبكات نسوية، مراكز رعاية مجتمعية تدمج العمل المدفوع وغير المدفوع وبتخلق فرص عمل قائمة على التكافل. هذه ليست مشاريع صغيرة، إنما نماذج اقتصادية حقيقية تعيد توزيع الموارد وتعيد تعريف القيمة. البديل النسوي يرى أن الرعاية الأساسية الأساس لا رأس المال هي اللي بتحافظ على الحياة، ويقيس النجاح بقدرتنا على إطعام الناس ورعايتهم وحماية الأرض، لا بالناتج المحلي الإجمالي ولا بالأرباح. الجي دي بي اللي أثبت فشله، اللي دلوقتي العالم قرر يتجه نحو انيشيتيفز ويناقش انيشيتيفز حوالين بيوند جي دي بي، واللي صندوق النقد نفسه جزء يلتحق بهذا الركب، وهو أمر يعني يبعث على السخرية. ولهذا تدعو الخارطة إلى ميزانيات نسوية على المستويين الوطني والدولي، وبحيث تقيم كل سياسات مالية وفق أثرها على المساواة والبيئة وحقوق الإنسان. أيضا الجزء الرابع اللي بتتناوله خريطة الطريق هي ديمقراطية الحوكمة الاقتصادية العالمية. تطالب خريطة الرباط إلى إعادة هيكلة الحوكمة الاقتصادية العالمية. لا يمكن تحقيق العدالة بينما تستمر المؤسسات التي خلقت هذه الأزمة كصندوق النقد الدولي والبنك الدولي في وضع قواعد تحتاج إلى اتفاقية أممية للديون قائمة على المشاركة الديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان والمبادئ النسوية. كما يجب مواجهة تصاعد نفوذ التمويل الخاص وآليات التمويل الممزوج أو البلندد اللي بتنقل المخاطر إلى القطاع العام وبتحول الأرباح إلى القطاع الخاص. في مؤتمر إشبيلية اللي هو FFD4 سيفيا فشلت الحكومات في معالجة الأسباب الجذرية ووصلت تبني نفس النهج القائم على السوق والديون. إحنا كحركات نسوية وحركات عدالة مناخية بنقول بوضوح: لا نريد إصلاحا بدون عدالة، لا نريد إدماجا بدون تغيير جذري، لا نريد تمويلا بدون إعادة توزيع ثروات. الجزء الخامس هي بناء تضامن عابر للحدود. لا يمكن لأي منطقة أن تواجه هذا النظام وحدها. تضع خريطة الرباط منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا داخل النضال الأوسع للجنوب العالمي، من أفريقيا إلى أمريكا اللاتينية ومن الكاريبي إلى آسيا. علينا أن نوحد الحركات النسوية والبيئية وحركات العدالة في وجه الديون تحت شعار واحد: السيادة الاقتصادية والرعاية من أجل الناس والكوكب. ويعني ذلك بناء تحالفات دائمة بين المزارعين والنقابات والمجموعات النسوية والمدافعين عن البيئة، وربط النضالات ضد الديون غير المشروعة في زامبيا وباكستان بالنضالات ضد التقشف في مصر وتونس. بالطريقة دي نقدر ننقل من مقاومة متفرقة إلى تحول منسق تقوده الشعوب. إزاي نوقف النزيف ده عمليا؟ إيقاف النزيف ده يتطلب العمل على عدة مسارات. المناصرة، المساءلة، تغيير السردية أو القوة السردية، تفكيك أسطورة التقشف. يعني ان التقشف يعني استقرار، وان الدين يعني تنمية، وان الخصخصة يعني تقدم. تفكيك هذه السردية وبناء حركة قوية. الاستثمار في التعليم النسوي وإعادة القيادات المجتمعية. تطرح خريطة الرباط فكرة المدرسة النسوية للعدالة الاقتصادية اللي مينا فهم بتعملها، يعني بتحاول تعملها كل سنة، واللي بنحاول نشاركها مع كل شركائنا، كمكان لبناء المعرفة المشتركة والاستراتيجيات العابرة للحدود. بالطريقة دي نقدر نوقف النزيف بالتنظيم المشترك، بالتضامن، وإعادة كتابة قواعد التمويل والتنمية. وختاما، تختم خريطة الرباط بجملة واضحة: نحن لا نقاوم فقط، نحن نبني من جديد. نضالنا ليس من أجل مقعد على الطاولة مع من خلقوا الأزمة، بل من أجل بناء طاولة جديدة قاعدتها الرعاية والكرامة والسيادة الشعبية. نرفض أن يعرف المستقبل بالديون والتدمير. فخريطة الطريق هدفها استعادة تمويل عام، إعادة توزيع الثروة، بناء اقتصادات الرعاية، وإعادة تخيل الحوكمة. بالطريقة دي نقدر نوقف stop the bleeding ونجعل العدالة واقعا. شكرا جدا، وأسفل الإطارة أرجو مشاركة خريطة الطريق مع الحاضرين، وأرجو أيضا يعني اللي حب يتضامن مع هذه الخارطة يمضي أو يساين الفورم للتضامن وبناء عمل جمعي على المستوى العالمي. شكرا.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shireen. That's a very, very powerful presentation, and I don't want to spoil the broth because people are going to internalize everything that you've said. And please share the roadmap because we all want to be part of this global building movement. And I totally agree, just transition cannot happen when we have all of these debts. And the declaration also provides a lot of alternatives, to debt, to loans, and actually what needs to happen so that we, critically invest in public services. Thank you so much. Please share the report declaration so that everyone can see. I also want to lastly introduce our last very incredible speaker, Catherine. Catherine is a researcher with 7 years of experience in development economics research, specializing in development financing. She holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's in public policy and administration. Catherine is a published author, contributing insightful pieces on governance and the impact of illicit financial flows, most recently on debt restructuring and debt sustainability analysis. She also offers a nuanced African perspective on credit rating agencies. Her focus is on providing research-backed policy alternatives that promote innovative and sustainable solutions to development challenges, especially in Africa. Currently, Catherine works as the Policy and Advocacy Officer for Sovereign Debt Management at the Africa Forum and Network on Debt and Development, famously known as AFRODAD. Catherine, last year we had the People's Tribunal, which was convened during the IMF and World Bank events, and basically looking at the new liberal policies and positions that the IMF has had in the past and their impacts on debt and on climate, but also on poverty and inequality. And recently I was part of an event that we organized, people-centered debt structuring mechanism. So what are some of the concrete shared demands and alternatives that, from your perspective, we need to be pushing forward as a collective in terms of what we want to see these institutions do, but also, their financial policies and priorities? You may take the floor now, Catherine.
So thank you so much, Collins, for the invitation to be part of this wonderful webinar during the Global Week of Action, and it's an honor being together with fellow colleagues like Shireen, May, and to meet Rosario and Titi, and to see that the struggle across the Global South is still strong among comrades, and just be happy to add the voice in this. So yes, Collins, we did have a tribunal early this year in Malawi. And this was actually an initiative that was a brainchild of APMDD. And we joined the bandwagon just to present African priorities or views of how IMF loans have been impacting the continent, specifically on the loan conditionalities. We termed it as an inquiry because the IMF, well, they were not present, so you could not have it as a a tribunal of sorts. So we did it as an inquiry where we brought mostly members of public from Malawi and other about 15 African countries. So it was held in Malawi. And we had actual citizen testimony about how IMF loan conditionalities have been affecting citizens directly. So I'll just maybe make the case for Malawi. Recently they did break away from one of the IMF loan programs, citing majorly that the loan conditionalities were not feasible for them and they could not continue with the program. And then we have also from Nigeria, one of our presenters or one of our witnesses did provide evidence right from the colonial period and the neo-colonial, how in the introduction of structural adjustment programs, how the manufacturing industry in Nigeria has continued to decline and actually taken the private sector approach. So we could provide more information around this as part of the tribunal. But we can see definitely from the citizens' perspective that loan conditionalities as it is right now and how governments are actually retracting from participating in them is an evidence that 50 years on, and even with the IMF, since its constitution in 1945, it has not actually provided debt sustainability for African countries. Apart from that, the tribunal, we have also been doing work around what we call the Africa Stop the Bleeding campaign. Majorly when it started, it was on preventing bleeding in terms of preventing or combating illicit financial flows. But what we've seen with the debt crisis, debt is becoming a form of illicit financial flows where countries are spending more on debt servicing compared to social sector spending. This is money that can be used, towards providing support to social sectors like health and education. And as Shireen has said, in the report, in the MENA region, this is actually the case. So with the African Debt Campaign, we are terming debt as part of illicit financial flows. And what we've been doing in this campaign is trying to bring awareness, or rather to bring about a broad movement of citizens drawn from civil society, trade unions, women rights activists, youth activists, to bring a citizen action and to win the hearts and minds of the people, of the populace, and to bring back the conversation on social contracts, and to bring back the conversation around that debt democratization and humanization of the debt crisis, right? That debt, actually, the struggles of debt connects to real day struggles of African citizens. And this is why, for example, when you see like in Africa, in Kenya, there's social unrest that was there last year. It was mostly because of the IMF and its policies and how it was actually impacting people in day to day. So with the Africa Debt Campaign focusing on debt as an illicit financial flow, we have three pillars around it. First, it's the political mobilization, and this is just to show how African countries can prevent unsustainable debt patterns. And it's also advocating for equalization of power balance between debtor governments and creditors so that you have fair and transparent contracts, but also where African governments are rule makers, as we usually like to say, and not rule takers in this equation of debt governments and creditors. So how we are doing this as part of the advocacy and political mobilization is, of course, having a political engagement. What this basically means is it's providing, for example, engaging the African Union, which we've been doing the better part of the last 2 years, trying to form a common African position, which finally this happened in May this year through the Lome Declaration, where Africa now has a common position on debt with specific demands. Key among them is on systemic debt reforms, and reform of the debt restructuring processes. As you know, right now, it's only 4 African countries that have are receiving debt restructuring treatment under the G20 Common Framework. With all its difficulties, it's still not providing enough relief for African countries. So this is now a position within the African Union that says we need to have better systemic debt reforms as it relates to debt restructuring, as it relates to a binding framework on debt treatment. And this, they have actually called for a United Nations framework on sovereign debt. So additionally to having a common position on debt, and as part of the political engagement, our approach is also to, as you're working on the global part of reforming the global financial architecture, is also to support financial institutions, African financial institutions, and building an African financial architecture. And this will help with scaling up resource mobilization. And also, it will help with strengthening debt transparency and legal frameworks that advise and correct this imbalance of debtors, African debtor countries and the creditors. So that is one pillar of the campaign that we are running. The other one is on civic mobilization, and I think my colleagues have spoke about this in the different regions, how they're doing this either through research, through advocacy, but for us, it's more about democratizing the debt discourse, right? We'll take different avenues. It's education, humanization of the public debt through the tribunal, like I mentioned. But it's also building on political systems to enhance transparency, accountability, and governance of elected officials, mostly at the national level. And what we're trying to support right now through national partners that we work with is to support citizen-led or parliamentary debt audits to identify illegitimate debt and build political cases around this, which will now form a case for debt cancellation. And this is mostly debt that is rooted in colonial or extractive origin. The other aspect of this is reframing, the narrative that Africa are bad borrowers. But in fact, the narrative is that Africa's debt is because of unjust systems, right? So it's now a political and mind change in terms of narrative, but also mindset of the citizens to understand that we are not bad borrowers, right? This narrative of that Africans are corrupt, have corrupt leaders, they don't know how to manage well, but it's also a case of unjust systems with issues of irresponsible lending, right? And lending that leads to governments cutting on their social sector spending. So that is another pillar that we focus on the campaign. And finally, is on legal advocacy, because our approach is that with debt, it's a contract, right? With a contract, there's some legal dimension to it. So this is where a lot of the power imbalances arise, where you have a debtor-creditor system where government borrows on behalf of government, of the citizens, but citizens are the ones who actually end up losing or being affected more. So it needs a rebalancing of this ecosystem, and how this can be done is through litigation to force legal policy and institutional reform. And some of the pathways we have explored through our partners, which I should have mentioned, from a consortium that has developed this campaign, is to pursue public interest litigation and on debt matters. So, for example, one of the partners, the Pan-African Lawyers Union, have recently instituted a case against the government of South Sudan to say that a debt that was contracted it was an oil contract, that it was contracted illegally, it was not on behalf of citizens, and this therefore should be considered odious, right? So it is to strengthen the voice of public, because the case it's been brought forward by public, that it's a public interest matter on debt, and it should be looked into as a legal pathway to reform some of these imbalances. But also, in a general sense, is to strengthen legal and policy frameworks for debt contraction, and to highlight the weaknesses in the existing debt contract. And you've done actually some research on the legal contraction frameworks of debt of Africa's debt. I can share that with you, Collins, to share with participants. And maybe just to finish on what citizen-led and trying to alternatives of these institutions is to consider reparative justice framework, which we actually had a conference around in August, where we are posing the narrative that reparations and reparative justice in solving the debt issue in Africa is a valid framework. Why? Because Africa's debt is actually, it has a colonial legacy, right? And there's consensus, both if you look at the research, if you look at the political, indications currently, with the African Union declaring 2025 as the year of reparations and reparative justice for Africans and people of African descent, is that Africans have actually suffered because of the colonial history, the transatlantic slave trade, and it has been more of extracting resources from the continent. And by that virtue is that it has put Africa at the low level of international discussions, decision-making, economic systems, and it has been the origin of Africa's indebtedness. So we do have a case to make for having reparations and as a valid framework for reparative justice, and to demand that we are paid not only what we have lost through the extraction, but also to make the case that if you look at the net present value of debt right now, it currently outweighs Africa's present debt by a factor of 10. That actually makes Africa a creditor to the global north. And in that sense, it makes the argument of illicit financial flows. So for us, we are now proposing or pushing for this reparations agenda as a valid framework to demand for the reform of this system that has actually indebted African countries. So and maybe I'll pause here, Collins, and happy to take questions from the audience, and happy to be part of this discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was very strong. Sorry, we've gone a little bit over time. I would like to then perhaps bring in my colleague Sally. I know some people have posed some questions, so we would like to create some time to respond to the questions, and then we'll take just 5 minutes to close down and give the next steps. So Sally, if you'd like to read out the questions.
Yeah, maybe I can step in for Sally.
Okay, sure.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone. I realize we have a few questions in the chat. I think some of the questions, I think in some ways have been responded to already. And I think others have also put some questions using the question and answer function. So maybe we can bring the spotlight back to our four speakers, or I guess five speakers actually. So looking through the questions, we have a few questions that are big questions that I think we sort of just heard in the last section in terms of how do we combat these banks and these institutions, right? So I think there's a few people that are sort of noting the really the impacts of banks like the ADB in trapping and entrapping states across Asia, for example. So in investing in infrastructure projects that are displacing indigenous people, that are impacting peasants, women. And so I think maybe just to sort of kick us off in thinking about sort of not only the alternatives and the solutions, but how we as civil society are responding. So we kind of heard the example of the People's Tribunal, but in thinking about what are the ways that we can really push for accountability and monitoring of some of these banks, and sort of thinking about what are the sort of mechanisms that are actually meant to bring accountability. And so whether that's through litigation or thinking about some of the structures that exist, but perhaps maybe to start, if anyone wants to sort of respond to sort of that umbrella of a question, which is a very big one, and perhaps maybe the biggest one, and I think one that we may not have a full answer to, but I think there have been some really strong examples of communities that have resisted and pushed back against, you know, through the IFC, for example, or through other banks, and thinking about accountability. Not always easy, but perhaps, yeah, if anyone is interested, TT, I see you have your mic off. Maybe you have some thoughts. No pressure.
No. I'm just thinking I work monitoring ADB since 2008, you know, also involved in the ADB safeguard review, trying to put many things, gender, accountability, information disclosure, this and that. And it was a good safeguard at that time, but at the implementation, it's flawed. You know, there's a lot of policy review, there is a lot of advocacy, but I don't think there is a lot of changes from that time to this time, because we face the same issue, you know, the same problems, and it increased. So the question is, do we have are we in the right tracks to work against them? That's the questions. So many times we have a joke in Indonesia, like ADB out of Asia, or joke to our colleagues in Manila, ADB out of Manila, something like that. But one of the important things that we need to realize that ADB only give money to the member countries. So the question is, if our country is not part of ADB, is not a member of ADB, then the country won't get finance. So the issue is, why don't we push our government to be out of ADB? You know, this kind of strategy. So one of the examples is like, you know, talking about ADB, IMF, or the World Bank, we have a new minister, the Indonesian minister, and he's clearly stated, don't believe IMF. Indonesia's trying to pay back all the debt, and then at least at one time it is free itself, the government, from the determination, from the domination of IMF in our national budget. So this is the way that we need to push our government, instead of believing that we need the money from the ADB, we need the money from debt from outside. If we look at our resources, Indonesia, for example, the corruption is trillions of rupiahs, billions of US dollars. So if we work at national level, get rid of the corruption, have a good governance, this and that, we are rich actually. We are poor because of our debt. We have to pay the debt. So maybe I'm thinking maybe we need to have a movement that push our governments to get out of ADB. That's another way to think.
Absolutely. Thank you, Titi. No, I think that's the reframe that is actually super helpful, right? I don't know if others want to respond to that set of questions. May, Rosario. Yes, May.
Yeah. So I think another outcome of FFD4 that we can build on is the borrowers platform, because the issue here also is really at the bottom of the debt problem is the power, the sharp inequality in power relations, that they hold this power over that these lenders hold power over the borrowing countries and exploit the vulnerabilities of global south countries, and also because our own governments are also collaborating or complicit. So this may be a good way to build power amongst the the global south countries, but making sure that we learn from the past, because past similar formations were easily dismantled because of the pressure of the banks and the global north countries that they immediately went into to divide and rule. So yeah, so that's one thing I'm looking forward to at how it's going to unfold. If first of all, are they even thinking of having civil society presence in the inaugural meeting, which has not been scheduled yet? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, May. Rosario, please.
Sí, voy a intentar hablar despacio esta vez. Creo que además de intentar, perdón, además de obviamente seguir con una lucha de fondo que tiene que ver sobre la cancelación de deuda, sobre luchar por nuestra soberanía y por tener herramientas comunitarias que nos permitan sobre todo cambiar las narrativas de estos bancos, que creo que esa lucha va de fondo. Creo que hay cosas que sí podemos empezar a hacer en lo inmediato, mientras damos esas batallas más de largo plazo, más de maratón, podemos hacer un spread más rápido, y tiene que ver con utilizar todas las herramientas vinculadas con la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas que ya están incorporadas a los mismos organismos que están generando estas problemáticas. Creo que se pueden pensar como dos grandes frentes por los cuales se puede agarrar el problema. Por un lado, utilizar todo lo que tenga que ver con construir narrativas comunitarias basadas en la experiencia local, que nos permita cambiar la manera en la que ellos están identificando el desarrollo y salirles a disputar sobre su propio lenguaje, qué es lo que están construyendo. Y por el otro lado, utilizar las herramientas que ya están abiertas, que ya están disponibles y lo que ellos mismos, digamos, ya generaron, que son todas estas herramientas como los mecanismos de queja. En el caso de América Latina, por ejemplo, el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo ya tiene un sistema formal que se llama MISI, que es el mecanismo de queja formal del banco, y organizaciones como IAP, donde yo trabajo, pero muchísimas en el ecosistema de las organizaciones que trabajan luchando para disputar qué es lo que entendemos por desarrollo. Utilizamos todos los días esos mecanismos para intentar generar muchísima presión desde adentro. Y la segunda cosa que me parece muy importante para generar esta presión interna tiene que ver con forzarlos a que nos den información, generar acciones de incidencia sin contar con la misma información con la que cuentan ellos es muy difícil. Así que creo que otro de los grandes pilares para poder dar disputa a esto que está sucediendo tiene que ver con solicitar información y obtenerla de manera temprana. En ese sentido, el sistema de alerta temprana, que ahora les comparto en el chat, es un paso hacia justamente ante la negativa de los bancos de brindar esa información, como organizaciones de la sociedad civil nos organizamos para buscarla, rastrearla, traducirla en un idioma amigable con las comunidades y publicarla a tiempo y que llegue a las personas adecuadas a tiempo. Porque si no mantenemos todos esos documentos técnicos de manera clara, accesible y que lleguen antes de que los proyectos sean ejecutados, es muy difícil dar la disputa. Creo que estamos siempre corriendo atrás y tenemos que por primera vez ponernos adelante. Ahora les comparto el link de esta iniciativa.
Thank you, Rosario. Thank you all, actually. I realize we are maybe running out of time. I realize there's a few more questions that maybe we can try to group together. So maybe one last set of kind of questions. And I think as we're thinking about climate finance and really the framing of reparations that Catherine actually left us with, and so I mean, for all of us who are working on these issues, we know that the state of climate finance is really in a dire state for many of the reasons that we heard today. But when it comes to actually the funding that's needed to really take on the climate crisis, of course, it's pennies in the bucket. The commitments that we're seeing being made, whether it's around loss and damage or within the Green Climate Fund, are really, really, really despicable given their historical responsibilities. Think about the common but differentiated responsibilities that many states and corporations, of course, are really owing to the global south. I do want to kind of ask this question. I see there was a few people that were asking this in the chat and thinking about, well, when it comes to conservation, we see often the sort of debt for nature swaps that are being pushed as a very much a false solution, and sort of thinking about, we'll forgive your debt if you commit to conserving land and territory that ultimately ends up displacing indigenous peoples. But these are sort of seen as solutions, and we see them, of course, as false solutions. And so I wonder if folks can think a little bit or share their reflection in terms of how do we actually think about climate finance that doesn't actually just perpetuate more loans, that really perpetuate the crisis, or that ends up actually displacing people. There was also sort of the question from Almar, I see in the chat, sort of looking at sort of green bonds and sort of the climate bonds initiative, which in some ways actually ends up also perpetuating more debt, and sort of seeing the language that is being used maybe is different, but the end result is often the same in the ways that it actually is debt creating structures under the auspices of climate finance or green finance. So maybe as like a closing and thinking about these connections between climate finance and debt justice as sort of a really strong nexus and pillar that we're all fighting for. If anyone wants to be brave and attempt any of that, I realize it's quite a few different things there, but I think, yeah, any reflections around sort of climate finance and sort of intersections with really these demands for debt cancellation and debt justice. I know we lost Catherine, and I realize that Shireen as well. But between Titi, Rosario, May, if either of you have any final reflections on this before we move into our closing in the last 10 minutes, that would be wonderful.
About climate finance, I mean, we are monitoring 15 Green Climate Funds projects claimed for Indonesia, and really disappointed because the money is not for the community. The money is actually for building another financial institution that promises for developing project for people, but the money is not for us. So GCF is so disappointing. CSO work hard for the establishment of GCF, to influence, to be in that meeting, and so on and so on. But the result. So the question is, and then the climate finance is still about debt, because part of it is only debt. And the other thing is, I really want to say that the NDC is increasing our debt, because once the government promised to reduce the greenhouse gases, the all that things, the question is the transition to the low energy technology or development is based on investment, which is from the developed country again, from the colonial countries, So it means it is the same pattern. Whether we talk about climate finance, whether we talk about development finance, that's the same pattern. So it means we really need to build on our own national economy, creating or developing our own domestic economy instead of hoping from outside, because the experience show it. Once we still rely depending on the finance from outside, then we still continue to be the object of exploitation from the colonial countries that once have the it's like prolong the histories until now. I'm very sorry for that, pessimistic on this issue, because years of working on this issue, then we need to realize, without building our national strength at national level, we will continue to be like that.
Thank you, Titi. I think sometimes a little pessimism is okay as long as we keep keep pushing. I think in some ways, I think we have to be realistic, and also I think what you're saying resonates, I think, for a lot of us. I don't know, Rosario, if you have one final comment before we go into the closing. Sí,
Es
adelante.
muy similar, sí, es
Sí.
muy similar a lo que planteaba Titi, así que lo voy a dejar muy cortito. Recupero también una pregunta que se hizo en el chat, que era sobre los bonos verdes. Estos bonos, digo, que fueron nombrados también en el chat, obviamente que están también volviendo a reforzar la lógica del extractivismo a través de distintas etiquetas. Al menos yo considero eso. Y considero al igual que Titi, y quiero reforzar esta idea de que la única salida que hay a esta problemática es si pensamos un nuevo sistema de energía, sobre todo para lo que tiene que ver con la agenda climática, un nuevo sistema de energía que esté descentralizado y liderado por las comunidades, que sea alternativo y que realmente esté enfocado en beneficio de las personas y no en beneficio ni de las compañías, ni de los gobiernos, ni de las instituciones de financiamiento. Creo que esa es la única manera de poder lograr, sobre todo, un sistema de energía, que es lo que más está impactando, no lo único, pero lo que más está impactando en el clima, que sea realmente democrático y soberano, que creo que ese es el gran desafío que tenemos todos los países, que sea realmente un sistema soberano. Y creo que el camino para eso, y quizás me estoy repitiendo con lo que dije con anterioridad, es a través de la lucha por la cancelación de la deuda, exigiendo reparaciones climáticas y frenando la deuda que se está generando en nombre de la justicia climática, de la mal llamada por ellos justicia climática en los países, sobre todo que estamos en el sur. Gracias.
No, gracias a ti, Rosario. Thank you so much. I think that's a really strong note to end on. And as we move into our closing, because like we're all saying, I think the only way forward is through collective struggle and through organizing. I see there was a comment in the chat from Francisco from the Consejo de Pueblos Wuxta, a Mayan organization across Guatemala, who is saying what we really need is a campaign to really decolonize our economy. And so these are not sort of piecemeal changes, but really we're pushing for the big transformations that really are what will guarantee our right to a future, right? If like Sankara was saying, we want to guarantee that right, we need to create this united front, right, across all peoples, across all struggles. And so I think with that, at least I hold on to the pessimism that Titi shared, but I do also have a little bit of optimism. So I'm trying to balance the two. And maybe in the last few minutes, I'll pass it to my colleague Collins to sort of share some few words of closing, and then we'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basma, and thank you so much to our amazing speakers. It has been a great moment to listen to the different views and opinions, but also most importantly, our shared goals and demands around what really needs to shift if these banks were actually to, respond to the current needs of the world. What people want to see these banks do today, and what are the current events that should shape what these banks should prioritize on. We've spoken about, why they need to consider, some cancellation of debts, especially for banks like the IMF, but also these other banks because they seem to subscribe to some of the conditionalities and impositions that the IMF has set. So they should also think about canceling some of these debts. We also feel that these banks must, in some way, support the structural reforms of the global financial architecture because they subscribe to it, and they would be one of those agents who should support, having a more responsive, equitable, and universal global financial system, them being part of it. And I think from other presentations where, speakers have spoken about the intergovernmental process that will lead to establishment of a UN Framework Convention on Debt, which I know will address, the fragmented borrowing and lending mechanisms which these banks are part of. And also just wanted to mention that recently there was a letter that was sent to the G20, which was highlighting a number of very important demands and views from the different civil society organizations, which will help to transform the system, but also the institutions and the mechanisms under which many of these banks operate. So there is a lot that has come out, responsible borrowing and lending, the discipline of the lenders and the creditors, which is very critical, the transparency and accountability mechanisms, and most importantly, information sharing, especially on what they're financing and who they're getting into arguments with. I think it's been an amazing conversation, and there is a lot of learning that has taken place, and there is a lot of things that we feel are very essential. So this is just to mention that this is part of our envisioned, this conversation is part of our envisioned broader campaign on the right to the future. As many speakers have said, with the ever-deepening debt crisis, the escalating climate change, as well as the worsening geopolitical environment, we cannot have our future guaranteed, and we cannot go into a just transition with all of these problems. So in some way, we must sustain something like a campaign. We must join our forces, and we must have very strong demands and calls for debt and climate justice for a better future. That being said, it all, culminates in us saying we need a united front and mobilization to face these challenges. So that being said, as ESCR-Net, we are organizing a campaign. We are in the process of having a campaign on the right to the future. And this campaign would actually encompass a lot of what we've said, targeting these banks, what we need to see them do in order to have the future that we all deserve. So it's been an amazing conversation, and thank you so much to everybody. We shall be inviting our allies and members to, think about this campaign, design it, and this information on the launch of the campaign will be coming your way as soon as possible once we agree on how we want to move forward. So thank you so much, everybody. I want to thank all our speakers for adhering to our call to be part of this conversation. Thank you for the very, very strong conversations, very, very strong interventions. I also want to thank our interpreters. I admire and actually envy your resilience and tolerance. Some of us can speak really quick. Thank you so much for being there and really understanding. I also want to thank our participants. Thank you so much for creating the time. I know we've gone overboard. Thank you so much for your patience. And lastly, team members, thank you so much, Basma, Angie, Sally. This has been an amazing event. We look forward to sharing materials from this conversation with everybody, but also some of the key action points that we would want to take forward, especially via a campaign to sustain this conversation on a joint front to really address the issues of debt. So thank you so much, everybody. I think we will end there for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody. Thank you so much. Merci
Bye.
beaucoup.
Thank
Gracias a
you.
todos.